It's been a packed day, and I suspect we probably look rather daunting up here just by our sheer numbers. But I have briefed everybody to be brief, and I trust that they will be. My name is Richard Carter. I shall be chairing this session. We will aim to finish no later than the closing time of 5:30. So please plan on that. I've been working in water management mostly in Africa and Asia all my working life, but in a variety of roles in consultancy, higher education and research. And I'm very pleased to be joined by a number of colleagues with diverse experience. All their biographical information is summarized in the program that you've got, so I'm not going to go through that in detail, just to save time. This session is being hosted by the UK Water Network, which some of you may have heard of and others may not. So I'm just going to ask Tim Brewer here to say a word or two about the UK Water Network, what it is and what it does.
Thanks, Richard. So just very briefly for people in the room and people watching online, UK Water Network is an open group of UK NGOs interested in international water issues, whether WASH or WRM, organised under the umbrella of BOND, but we're keen to involve stakeholders beyond NGOs. So if you're interested, if you're an NGO and you're interested to join the network, if you didn't know about it, the co-chairs are myself and Katie Spooner from CAFOD. Please contact us, and if you're not an NGO but you want to be involved in events or in the discussions that we hold, again, please do contact us to participate. Thanks, I'll pass back.
Thank you very much, Tim. Okay, we have three speakers. Katie Spooner from CAFOD first, then Vincent Casey from WaterAid, and followed by Kat Moncrieff from WWF. We'll take all those presentations, and then I'll say now that what I plan to do with the discussion is to alternate comments or questions from the discussants and from you, the other participants in this meeting. So we'll bounce back and forth a little bit and hopefully get some conversation going and not just Q&A. So when the opportunity comes up, it'll be first come, first served, so get your hand up quickly. I'm going to hand over straight away then to Katie from CAFOD, and yeah. If you want to say any more about yourself, Katie, please do, but it's over to you.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Maybe just to explain a little bit about CAFOD. I guess we're not the type of organisation that you would necessarily be your go-to when talking about water projects. We are a generalist organisation, have only really started focusing through that generalism on water in the last couple of years, although we always have had some water projects. And just to give that background, because actually a lot of the water projects we work in are based in other areas of, I guess, of the thematic areas of interest, which could be maybe coming at water from a gender perspective. We're looking at some of the private sector work, looking at mining and extractives. And yeah, looking at our livelihoods or our DRR work. So this, I want to just talk you through a case study that's actually a project that we've been working on in the Andes in Peru. And this actually, we started working with this community and on this issue through a mining issue and looking at some of the impacts of the mining company on the community. But it quickly became obvious that this actually wasn't a water issue, and that was then the perspective we took on it. But I wanted to go through this. It is really a very simple case study, but I think it highlights some of the challenges of working at a community level. And I think we've heard a lot about the approaches that we can take and some of the tools that we can use. But actually, what are the blockages that come at a community level, and what are some of the ways in which we can approach those? So the area that we're looking at, the watershed we're looking at, is of Lake Perón in Peru. And Lake Perón itself is actually a glacial lake. It looks beautiful there. And you look at it and you think, really, what could go wrong? So we have, it's an area where there's multiple stakeholders and multiple interests going on. It is obviously, Peru is a poor country and looking at different ways of economic development. And in the Lake Perón catchment, there's interests of hydropower, of mining, and this brings an interest of the Ministry of Energy and Mining. There's also planned open cast gold mine. There's urban stakeholders, so there are urban drinking water users, which brings in the interests of urban municipal government and the local water company. We also have a rural demand with drinking water, subsistence agriculture, agriculture for the market, fishery production, irrigation. And then we bring in the challenges and the environmental interests. So this is actually a national park. It's a protected area. There's an interest in keeping the flows going, although how strong that is could be debated. But the Ministry for Environment is also a stakeholder on that issue. And importantly, we'll come to more at the end of climate change and the glacial retreat. So this CAFOD came to this project when I guess the story of this project starts a little bit earlier. So this has always been an area of sustainable farming. There's a rural community of about 4,000 people who live in the area farming. And I guess tensions were rising. There was a hydropower plant nearby, and the hydropower plant very much did what the hydropower needed. So when they didn't have enough water, they closed the gates. And when they had excess water, they opened gates. Very logical from their point of view. But for the community, this meant that there was no consultation, and so when those gates opened, their crops are flooded. When those gates were closed, their crops died. And these tensions had been building. And I've put a picture up here of 2 padlocks, which is very symbolic in this case. So this is where it really came to the crux of the community saying, look, you're destroying our livelihoods. We really need to start working on this issue. And the control for the release of the gates was in a padlock office. And so the first thing that the community did, and the first negotiation they made, was to put 2 padlocks on that door, and one belonged to the community and one belonged to the hydropower company, and neither could open that padlock without the agreement from the other. So that was the first step in the process of a multi-stakeholder agreement as it became. And so I guess this, although it was a very difficult issue at the time, it became a platform whereby the community could start to negotiate some of their other interests and other concerns. And so, as I mentioned, there was a mining company in the area at the time, and the community started to say, well, look, we've got, our animals have started dying. We think this is a problem. We think that there might be a problem with the water. We think it's coming from the mining company. So the government came in and, they were talking to the government, and they came together as good partners, and they started to talk about these issues, and they said, right, we're going to monitor this. Let's do it. We're going to try and address these issues. So the government responded with a static monitoring program across 400 sites of the Perón watershed. This was a one-off water quality monitoring point. They did it all within a very short time frame. And the output of that was 3,000 documents, individually written by different ministries in uncoordinated manner. And the government and partners, each of the stakeholders who are represented there said, in the interest of sharing information, we will share all the reports with you. And they gave the community photocopies of these 3,000 documents and said, well, off you go. You have the information, you can work out the problem from there. And from this perspective, really, the government and the partners involved, they were doing what they felt was needed. They collected the information, they shared the information, the community had access to the information. really how much further could they go. Well, obviously we're talking about subsistence farmers, and they are not hydrologists, they're not soil scientists. There's very scientific information in these 3,000 documents. And so this is a point at which CAFOD came in, and actually with their partner Newcastle University, to try and interpret this data and trying to understand what it meant for the community. And a number of things happened, but they quickly realised that this data couldn't actually be usefully used for the purposes of the community who really wanted to know what were the challenges with their water, what were the threats to water quality, how would they be able to use this water sustainably in the future. So instead, Newcastle University and CAFOD set up, and this is an ongoing project, they worked with the community members and the community municipality leaders to identify 14 monitoring points, which would be a dynamic monitoring project over a period of 3 years, I understand. And they would monitor and analyse this information with the community, gathering the questions that were coming directly from the community and from the municipality and trying to answer that with the data available. Okay, so one of the so out of this information, one of the key things that they've identified is actually the water quality is not so much of an issue in this basin for different hydrogeological reasons, and they've started to look more at water quantity. And if we just go back to all of these key stakeholders, and particularly, as I said, the last one with climate change, we've got a multi-stakeholder uses of limited water supplies in this area, and those supplies are being reduced because there is there's been a 10% decline in the glacial melt over the past 6 years. This is also, again, the economic instruments become very important. This is an area where they want to develop, particularly agriculture as well. So the work and the monitoring for the partnership through Newcastle and CAFOD actually identified that actually in this basin, water quantity was going to be the real issue. And the next stage of the work will be looking at identifying a water balance for the region and looking at how water allocations can be made sustainably between all of these partners. So, you know, it's not necessarily groundbreaking in that area. I think that's quite standard and quite typical of some of the challenges that we face in water resource management. But I think some of the key points coming out for me, well, some of the challenges, and really the main one was this knowledge fragmentation. Often when we work in water resource management, it's a complex, it's unstructured, it's what we call wicked problems. And I think we need to recognise the challenges that come in sharing this information, and that we might, with the best of intentions, create information and databases and try and share that. But if we don't understand the purpose of that from each of the stakeholders' perspectives, then are we really creating valuable data sources, and are they going to address the questions that each of the stakeholders is answering or is asking? So I think for me, really in this case, highlighted the need to recognise different knowledge discourses and the different needs for data between different stakeholders, and making sure that the data we use, that it's collected efficiently and effectively, but it's also disseminated to meet the needs of stakeholders. So I think, yeah, there are a couple of other challenges which are worth mentioning, that they've also been challenged in finding a university partner in a local area nationally, because a lot of universities, I understand, receive money from the mining companies, and this would be a conflict of interest. There is also the challenging political situation with new local government elections. And when they're working with a municipality, they've done a lot of work to try and engage local government and get their support for that. But with changing political circumstances, obviously that's a challenge. And also I think we've talked a lot about the involvement of corporations and in these situations. And I think there's a lot of good willingness in this room, but I think one of the things that we have to recognise, and has come through in this case, is that there always is a power inequality when we're looking at communities versus corporations. And I think, and that's not necessarily, you know, the big bad corporation stance, but it's an economic and it's a poverty argument as well. And I think that it's not enough to say that you know, we will treat communities equally, we will give them a voice. We have to almost give some positive discrimination to the voice of the table of communities, because they already are at a disadvantage in this power inequality. So yeah, that's just sharing a case study from some of the work that we do, and hopefully describing some of the challenges in the projects that we find with WRM.
Thank you very much, Katie. We're hearing themes that have come through earlier in the day, as well as a grounded example there of those problems expressing themselves on the ground. And as Katie says, it's not always a case of doing groundbreaking things, but doing things that have been tried and tested elsewhere and found to work, but applying them in a situation where they haven't been done. We'll move on to another environment in West Africa. Vinnie Casey from WaterAid is going to take us there. And do use the mic.
Great, thanks very much, Richard. I think, like Sam, I might stand for this as well, because I don't like sitting down either presenting. So I'll just stand over here. I'm just going to run through a case study from Burkina Faso. It outlines an approach to achieving water security at the local level. And so I'll go into a bit of detail about it. Traditionally, WaterAid are a WASH agency, water sanitation hygiene. And many of you may know that WASH agencies have struggled with application of IWRM at the local level. So what this approach really aims to do is to bring WASH closer together with water resource management practices. It's acknowledged that standard approaches to WASH service delivery don't adequately prepare communities to manage on an ongoing basis many of the water-related threats that they face. The WASH practices tend to focus on asset management, on the conditions immediately around a water point, but the broader resource issues aren't widely acknowledged. So people consequently remain vulnerable to a multitude of water-related risks, with coping strategies that are very fragile. And similarly, when it comes to IWRM, they also remain out of reach of many of the basin authorities. We've had some discussion about those today. Many of them are newly set up. Their capacities are low. They don't have the reach to get to the rural poor in areas that are perhaps in situations where there isn't huge abstraction going on for irrigation, but at the same time people are facing water-related risks that require management. So what this approach attempts to do, it's not a solution in every situation, it's a solution, or we don't even know if it's going to be successful really in the long term, but it's really a solution in this particular case where it's been applied. It combines delivery of WASH services, water sanitation hygiene, with actions that strengthen resilience to water-related risks, with the aim of really reducing risks people face to their livelihoods and their health. So the approach itself is called community-based water resource management. And if I could just start by saying perhaps what this approach isn't, rather than what it is at this stage. The fact it's called community-based water resource management doesn't mean that it's simply focused on these communities themselves. It doesn't mean that it's putting the onus on communities to be completely responsible for managing their water-related risks and their water resources. It doesn't mean circumventing national institutions. It doesn't mean just simply focusing on local level impacts. What it is, and what it does mean, is that the very first step is to forge a relationship at the national level with national government and get national buy-in to the process of extending support to communities to manage water-related risk at the local level. So the first step is really to get the consensus and buy-in of national institutions responsible for water management, to get the buy-in of local governments before you actually start working in communities. So the aim of the approach, although it's called community-based water resource management, is to complement national water resource management strategies and processes. But it's really to realize the potential of people at the local level to play a very active role in managing their own water resources and risks with assistance from authorities. So in the villages where this approach is being applied, there are multiple threats to water resources. Extremely long dry seasons, 6 to 8 months long, very unpredictable rainfall, high levels of climate variability, major drought risk, surface waters prone to drying up, and that puts dependence on what small amount of boreholes there are available for supply year round. Growing populations, pressure on land and water resources, the usual problems. More water resources required to meet growing food needs. Large numbers of livestock in these communities. There's a large dependence on livestock and pastoralism. And increasingly irrigation is practiced, although not with intensive abstraction, but certainly bucket irrigation that requires agricultural wells. So the combined effects of these issues are really long queues at boreholes, queue jumping, conflict, local conflict over access to the small number of boreholes that there are, individuals taking more water than perhaps would be considered fair, heavy stress on pumps and heavy use by animals, pollution around water sources if they're not designed to deal with that animal use. But overall, the issue here is that there are some mechanisms at the local level to deal with it, but they're not supported. There's no formal procedures for dealing with some of these conflict issues, and it does lead to local tension. So there is this need for some form of management there. So just a high-level overview of this approach. It's based on the NGO playing a facilitating role at the local level rather than doing water resource management. NGOs, how can they know more about doing water resource management than anyone else? So it's about facilitating, understanding the threats that people face at the local level, monitoring those threats, very important. How can you possibly manage any kind of situation without monitoring what it is that you're trying to manage? So monitoring of water resources, monitoring of threats at the local level. Now, what you see in the monitoring of the threats, what the communities most importantly see in the monitoring, what the local authorities see in the monitoring, translates into action aimed at better management principles at the local level, but also better wash services. And so the combined impact of these two improvements, or these two steps, is to reduce risk that people face overall. So here's an example just of vulnerability mapping at the local level with a women's group in one of the villages where this approach is used. Threats are identified by people, but then they're monitored. So we have rainfall monitoring taking place in the village, monitoring of groundwater levels in agricultural wells taking place in the village, and the people that are doing the monitoring are the farmers. You're engaging the people who are perhaps quantity-wise the big water users. You're engaging women, you're engaging everyone who's involved in water use in this monitoring. It's done in the community, and we'll say a bit more about why that is in a moment. As backup to this rainfall monitoring, this groundwater level monitoring, in boreholes, which in the wash sector, you know, there's a big emphasis on water quality, there's a big emphasis on sealing these sources up. It obstructs any kind of monitoring. So here the team have designed access points within the boreholes on the hand pumps themselves to install monitoring devices, which are these submersible level loggers. Now these are quite high-tech devices. We don't in any way expect the community to be pulling these out or reading them. But in the regional support directorate, there are people who can do this and people who can read these loggers people who can verify that the information the community are collecting matches the trends that they're seeing in groundwater. Now, just to say a bit about why it's important to do this monitoring locally, in these kinds of environments, there's high spatial variability in rainfall. In one village, they might receive a certain amount of rainfall per year. In the other village, 2 kilometers away, just 2 kilometers away, it may be a different amount. Now, if you're dependent on a weather station to get that information, that may be 20 kilometers away, and you'll see a different amount. The geology in these areas is crystalline basement. You've got pockets of differential weathering. You're drawing on water in fracture zones that are not necessarily connected. So the groundwater levels may be different across those zones. So it's important to monitor locally for getting a true picture of what's going on, but most importantly, to involve people in the process of understanding what the risks are at the local level. So here, this woman's group is translating what they see in groundwater levels changes over time. These pieces of paper are from the local school. The tools for plotting this out are from the local school. It's actually the farmers who plot these groundwater levels out. Here it is in graph form. Just very quickly, this shows 2 years. This project's been running for 5 years. There's 4 years worth of data, groundwater levels and rainfall collected by the community. 2 years, this is rainfall from 1 year, and then you see, if you can see, the next year, it's completely different, much, much lower rainfall the following year. And the red circles highlight areas or periods of time when the wells that are being monitored are actually out of action. But they're not just out of action because of a lack of rainfall towards the tail end of the dry season. This one's out of action because it's submersed underwater in flooding as well. So what this information, what the community use it for, is planning their planting, their cropping, their water use. We'll talk a bit more about the operating principles when they kick in based on this information. Okay, so operating principles, better management. When you have this information, you can agree allocations between different water users that are flexible, dynamic over time. You can agree, times when different people can use and can't use the water sources, and for what purpose. And if you see a situation whereby, there's possibility of a drought, low rainfall, then rationing can kick in, and certain water uses can be restricted. But people have to have an incentive to do this work beyond just having this information. It's great, it's wonderful to have this information, but why would I, as a farmer, bother to collect this stuff if I'm not going to get anything out of it? So it has to be coupled with improvements to wash services. And that information is used to make the case with local authorities to get better wash services, to get more wells, to get assistance when it looks like there's going to be problems with the water resource availability. So that has to come, or there's no incentive to do it. So really, I'll just summarize here because I don't have much time now, that this approach is really about cementing the relationships between the national government, local government, and communities, and strengthening the pathways for people to call for assistance, and strengthening or reducing the risks that people are facing at the local level. It's just to say a couple of things about challenges. Incentives are a big one. As I said, if people don't see improvements, they won't do it. But also in some countries, the national government may not be that welcoming to this kind of thing. I mean, this kind of thing has been rolled out in partnership with the meteorological authorities, in partnership with the government bodies responsible for monitoring water resources, who are happy to see the data and use it even, but that may not be the case in all countries. So it seems to be working well here. I'm certainly not saying it's a panacea at all. It needs to be tried and tested elsewhere. So yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Vinny. And again, a reminder that communities, particularly in areas with experiencing high water vulnerability, have a vested interest in monitoring and managing their own water resources, and also a capability to do so, and to do it in partnership at other levels of society. We'll move on to our third presentation now, which is from Kat Moncrieff from WWF. And I think you're taking us to the other side of the continent. So, Kat,
well,
Kat,
I think I'm
thank you.
taking you all over, actually.
Okay.
Okay. So I think I really do have the graveyard slot here, so please bear with me. I hope it will be interesting. So I want to use this time to really bring rivers to the focus of the debate around water resources management. I don't think I've actually heard the word river today. I have been listening. I don't think even Dave Tickner from WWF said river. I think I heard the word ecosystems a little bit, but I don't think rivers have been part of our debate today, so I want to bring them back into focus. So, I don't know where to look. So, here's a quick summary of what I want to talk about. Firstly, as I said, I want to talk about why rivers are fundamental for equitable and sustainable growth. Then I'm going to touch very quickly on why it's so challenging to keep our rivers flowing. And then I'm going to talk about how WWF is trying to address some of those challenges. So, as I'm sure most of you know, WWF is a conservation organisation, but we're not just about nature. Humans are actually important to us too. So our vision for our work on water is a future in which both nature and people have sufficient water to flourish. But I'm going to make the point again, let's not forget about the river. Because the basic functions of a healthy river actually underpin livelihoods and they underpin the economy. So those functions of the river help to produce productive fisheries, they provide flow for hydropower for economies, they provide nutrients and sediments for agricultural land. So rivers are absolutely crucial. And if we exploit them to breaking point, we're just not going to be able to sustain our economies in most places. And that picture there is from the Mekong, where you've got tens of millions of people in the lower Mekong who are dependent on fisheries. And if we start building dams on the mainstream of the Mekong and disrupt the flow, then those fish aren't going to be able to migrate, and those millions, tens of millions of people are going to lose their food security and their livelihoods. So central to our work on keeping rivers flowing is the concept of environmental flows. So this isn't about taking a river back to its natural state at the beginning of time. This is about trying to ensure the right volume, timing, and quality of flow to achieve the basic processes of the river that sustain people's livelihoods and the economy. So we've done a lot of work at WWF on environmental flows, particularly on trying to assess what that environmental flow should be. And here are some examples of reports that we've written about environmental flows assessment in the Upper Ganges. Now, what's interesting about the Ganges is that it's a holy river. So one of the important things that came out of our environmental flows assessment was that people really wanted, one of the most important things people wanted the river to do for them was to provide a sufficient amount of flow for religious and cultural activities. So one of the key things that we've done is work closely with the government and other users of the river to try and ensure an environmental flow during the Kumbh 2013 festival. And that's a festival where you have millions of people jumping into the Ganges. So it's very important to have the right amount of flow there. So assessing the environmental flow is difficult. You need a lot of time, a lot of resources. You need to involve lots of different user groups. But it's not nearly as difficult as trying to implement environmental flows. And actually in 2010, based on several years of experience, we produced this publication, the Implementation Challenge, which sets out the main challenges to achieving environmental flows and also how to address them. And you can probably imagine what many of those challenges are. They're the usual suspects: lack of capacity, lack of financial resources, lack of engagement with politics, as we heard about earlier this morning. So I suppose underpinning this challenging environment is a crisis of water resources governance. States don't seem to be capable of managing their water resources appropriately. And it's also a complex environment out there. Katie talked about complex or wicked problems. These are water resources problems are typically characterized as complex problems. They're fraught with uncertainty, with disagreement between different actors, and distributed capacities. And by that I mean different people with different powers and mandates, wanting different things from the river and working in isolation. And I quite like this diagram, which is from the FT, which shows people doing just that, working in isolation, looking in opposite directions, and ultimately they're going to destroy the natural resource that they all depend on. Okay, another reason why it's such a challenging environment out there for water resources management and e-flows implementation. What we find is there's actually little evidence for what types of water management intervention achieve desired outcomes. And I've tried to demonstrate that here with this very simplistic results chain. I don't want you to look at it too closely because it's just sort of trying to demonstrate a point that actually there isn't too much evidence, if you look carefully, for certain water resources management interventions having those desired outcomes in terms of society and the economy. And that's in contrast, I think, to the wash sector, where actually there's a lot of evidence to show that putting in place water supply systems, putting in place sanitation, as we've heard about earlier, has those outcomes on education and on health, and that go on to improve the economy or to reduce poverty. And it's been very good to hear a couple of people today talk about the need for a greater evidence base. That really sort of resonated with me. So with all those challenges, how is WWF navigating them? How am I doing for time?
You're fine.
Am I fine?
Yep.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk, we're doing lots of things, but I'm going to focus on three very briefly. So firstly, we're embracing this idea of complexity. And one place where we're doing that is in the Ruaha River Basin in Tanzania. So the Ruaha is one of the main tributaries to the Rufiji Basin. And it's meant to look like this, but since 1993 in the dry season, it's mostly looked like that. So this is absolutely catastrophic for wildlife, of course, but also for all the people that depend on that river. So it's a typical complex environment. You have water use conflicts, you have political interference as different groups try to solve the problem. There's a lack of cooperation and coordination between the different groups involved. So we're embracing this complexity, trying to move away from a linear pathway of addressing the problem, which is quite typical of NGOs, to follow a kind of results chain approach to addressing a problem. So we're doing this thing called social learning, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It sounds a bit like participation, multi-stakeholder participation, and it is, but I'd say that it's participation plus, if you like. It's about dialogue, co-learning, and action research to achieve convergence on objectives and change in practice, which we hope will bring flows back to that river in the dry season. So it's a pilot project. We've been doing it for a couple of years. There is definitely progress, but we're yet to see the river flow. So watch this space. Excuse me. Another thing we're trying to do is getting better at generating this evidence for what works and what doesn't in terms of water resources management. And this is important. Why is this important to WWF? Firstly, it's important for our work on water stewardship. So we've talked about this lots today. We want companies to invest in water resources management practices that improve flow in the river because they see the business case. They see it reduce their risks. not because it's a nice CSR activity. David Norman from SAB Miller spoke earlier today. He spoke about win-win situations in Colombia, in India. So there are places where you can demonstrate the fact that if you do that upstream, you'll end up with flows in your river and your risk will be reduced. But actually, we found it's very difficult to demonstrate that evidence base in many places because catchments are just too big, there's too many players, it's not simple. It's also important for our work convincing governments to expand the pilot work that we're doing. So, for example, we've put a significant amount of work into setting up water user associations in East Africa. But until we can demonstrate the tangible benefits of those water user associations in terms of livelihoods, in terms of flows back in the river, it's going to be hard to convince the government of scaling up to the basin. So you can see why evidence is so important for us. And actually we're embarking on a PhD with King's College to look into this problem of what have water user associations done for the rivers. Okay, so my last slide, you'll be pleased here. So the third thing that WWF is doing, we're looking into smart ways to manage trade-offs between multiple objectives of water resources. So we'd like to see more open and participative discussions around trade-offs. So they're not just confined to boardrooms of companies or governments. What looks promising, and I'm sure what a lot of you have heard about, is these multi-criteria analysis approaches. So ranking water development scenarios using multi-criteria that are aligned to reflect the multiple objectives of water resources management. So that might be increased power generation, food security, poverty reduction. For environmentalists, it might be river connectivity, all those sorts of things. And we're looking into this in our work with hydropower, and particularly in the Amazon. So this map here shows the western Amazon, and there's a tributary there in Peru, and that shows all the dams that are planned on that one tributary. So we're developing a tool for that basin, which is going to demonstrate the best dam scenarios for achieving multiple water resources objectives. So that will be achieving power generation, but making sure that the impact on the environment and the impact on society is as small as possible. So this is all good stuff, but I think a challenge will be finding the metrics, the language, and the methods that engage different groups of people properly. I think Katie spoke about this. These multi-criteria analysis tools, they're very complicated. They chuck out graphs and all sorts of things. And you have to think in multiple dimensions. So you need to find ways that we can use these tools so that they speak to lots of different groups of people. So that's all I've got time for. I feel I've only really scratched the surface of what we're trying to do. I don't pretend to have the lessons, or I don't pretend to have the solutions, I suppose. Maybe I've got a few lessons, but I don't pretend to have the solutions yet. We're still learning. As I said, it's a very complicated environment out there in which to be working. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Kat, and thank you all of our speakers for some very interesting, stimulating presentations, taking us to different countries and different parts of the world. We've, as I said at the beginning of the session, we've got 4 discussants on my right, on your left. Just briefly, I'll introduce them by name. Gary Sharkey at the end from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Jane Joseph immediately on my right from WaterWitness International. Beatrice Mosello sitting next to Gary from ODI here, and Leslie Morris-Iveson from Oxfam. I'm going to ask them in turn, but alternating with you, to make a comment or a question to our presenters, or to points that have come up from the audience, or if anything comes up online there too. I should warn you, Julian, this is about to run out of power. So I'm going to ask Gary first, if you've got a point or a question that you want to address, but then I'll immediately go over to the audience for one contribution.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Should be fine, I talk loud. I was really glad that Kat ended with some of the words metrics, language, and methods, because echoing Katie's earlier statements, I think that's, well, at least as in PwC, you know, that's kind of a space that we play a lot. But I think I'm going to apply it more to what Vinny was talking about in terms of community-based water resource management. The importance and the significance of the communities, both in rural, as he was talking, and also in urban environments, is one that we really have to pay good attention to. So we've been saying throughout the day, what is the role of business? How do we get business more engaged? How do we get business more involved? Well, this is what business does. It figures out numbers and ways of crunching things out. And we touched on some of that in the last session in terms of valuation of environmental and social impacts and decision-making based on those. And so a project that I've been working on with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development for the last few years, maybe WaterAid was also consulted in the development of that. I know WSUP was, but they've built a community spa or a community hub that's basically wash plus waste services. But then those waste streams are repurposed, sold into electricity, biogas, etc., providing revenue streams to make it a more sustainable base of the pyramid, inclusive business type solution. That's just one, and if you go on WVCSD website, there's a nice shiny video about it. But behind that, there's a very well thought out and calculated business model, business plan, all the financial calculations. And so that's, when we were having a discussion in the last session about this, there's water valuation, social impact valuation, environmental impact valuation. At least where I sit, these are some of the fastest growing areas in terms of tools that companies, nonprofits, and governments are using to try and help them get a handle on, okay, how are we going to assess and compare priorities among these stakeholders and manage those trade-offs that Kat was talking about. So that's, I guess, my immediate reflection from those, and over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Gary. Can I call for any contributions? Yeah, please, over this side. And I did see two hands. Was it Ian? No, at the back, yeah. So we'll take two.
Hi, so my name's Paul Hutchins. I'm a researcher at Cranfield University. So my question's mainly for Vincent, but I think it applies to the whole panel, really. You talked for your WaterAid's community-based water resource management program, you talked about the importance of getting high-level kind of government approval, and then you talked about your work at the community level or the household level. I also saw in your diagram the kind of intermediate level, the local government level, and I just wanted to talk a bit about how you try and include those types of actors in your work, because I think that's a real gap in development generally. We're very good at the top-end high-level stuff, pretty good at understanding what happens in communities, but really it's the local government and these kind of actors, people working at the intermediate level, that we really need to get on board with these types of programs.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And the lady at the back. We'll just take two for the moment.
Hi, my name's Aline. I'm a research consultant at the IDL group. And my question's actually quite linked because it was about scale as well. And especially there's been lots of talks about these pilot projects and having to scale up at a national level, but not so much talking about scaling up even higher than that. And as we all know, many of these big basins cover several countries, Mekong or the Nile Basin. And I just wanted to ask the panel quite basic question of how much dialogue and how many actions you see happening at that level and how important you think that is as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's, can we start with Vinny?
Yep.
Yep, and then go to Katie and Kat if you want to add anything.
Great, yeah, thanks Richard. So thanks Paul for your question there. Completely agree. The district government or intermediate government level is absolutely critical. That's where the action happens. National government can give consent and form high-level policies, but when it comes to getting movement on the ground, the districts are really the units to operate at. So what we do with this approach is to basically set up a core team which includes someone from the national government, and then when it's decided where to work, bring in representatives from the district government into that planning team, and then as a sub-team, which is a technical team which deals with the implementation. So within that implementation team is someone from the district government, someone from the NGO partner, who are doing the work on the ground. So the role of the local government basically is to respond to the calls from the community for assistance, and that requires a good relationship between the two. So this method, this way of doing things aims to cement that. So that's how we bring them in with this approach. Just on the question about basins, within the IWRM model, many of these countries have set up basin authorities, which, although we were referring to the administrative boundaries that exist in national and local government, the basin authorities deal with the basin dimensions. And as I say, the approach aims to strengthen those institutions, not circumvent them. It aims to bring some means for them to have some actual practical impact on the ground instead of just being there and talking about doing basin water management. It attempts to get this them to have some practical impact. So it engages with those institutions in parallel, really. That's the aim, yeah.
Thanks. Katie.
Okay, so yes, again, the question on local governments. Yep, the local government was a partner alongside the community in the project in the Lake Paron. So they were instrumental in setting the monitoring points of building, of being engaged in the analysis, and then negotiating that with different stakeholders and mining companies. But one of the challenges was that the local government are up for re-election. So working with the local government is really important, but it does present a natural challenge of particularly in this project, that there is then a turnover of local government and not being very sure what you'll be working with. So I think it's important to have strong multi-stakeholder relationships as well, just for the continuity and sustainability of the project. But absolutely, the local government should always be involved. In terms of dialogue at the basin level, we don't really work at a transboundary level in CAFOD. We're very small-scale projects. I would say from my previous experience, yeah, the river basin levels do tend to be, for ones that I've worked with, in my experience, have been quite under-resourced. There seems to be this kind of blockage in terms of national level engagement, maybe transboundary political discussions, and this kind of principle of subsidiarity doesn't really seem to capture the river basin. So I think it would definitely be an action point to try and work and strengthen it and engage those in WRM discussions. But many of them are very new in terms of IWRM. You know, they've been set up in a relatively short time frame. So it'd be interesting to see how they look as we go through the post-2015 framework.
Thanks, Katie.
Okay.
Kat.
Yeah, I'll just respond quickly to those questions. Thank you. So, Paul, yes, local government institutions. I'd say that WWF does quite a lot of work with those intermediate institutions between national level governments and local communities. We probably spend quite a lot of our time taking those sort of guys out for lunch and dinner. I know we do this a lot in China, trying to influence them. And in fact, a lot of our work is about influencing those people in those local institutions that we feel hold the power to make change, and also the people in high-level national institutions as well. Going up a scale to look at transboundary river basins. Yes, I think I'd probably echo what Katie said. There are these these transboundary institutions, but how much power and they really have is yet to be seen, really. Many of them have been set up under the premise of IWRM. They've just become these big institutions, but they don't really have much mandate. In the back of my mind, I have the Mekong River Commission, which I know has failed to prevent the construction of the Shiabori Dam to date. So we've worked very closely with the Mekong River Commission, trying to prevent dam building that's going to destroy the river. But it hasn't worked so far, so it's almost having to circumvent that high-level institution now and try and lobby the private sector, so the banks who are funding those hydropower dams. It's a different approach.
Okay, thank you, Kat. I'd now like to invite Jane on my right to throw in any comment or question from your point of view. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much. Some very interesting inputs from the speakers. We are also facing the same challenges from the project which I manage in Tanzania, the Fair Water Futures project. We face some issues in water security, around pollution, conflicts, institutional performance, environmental impact assessments. Some projects go without environmental flows, and we are really trying to get a new approach in the system. We are trying to use citizen agency and social accountability to actually empower the right holders to be able to make the duty bearers accountable, rather than helping the government in service provision. I've heard from Katie the challenges that you face in Peru, and Gary's presentation on achieving water security at the local level, and also the experience of the Ruaha River Basin. In Africa and Tanzania, Kenya particularly, for the past 2 decades, focus has been on inventing policy, laws, and institutions on water resources management. And a lot of resources had been used to set these institutions and to do some researches around water resources management. But then we are trying to see now the water resources management challenges, like the situation and status of the river health is not improving. The challenges are almost the same from back 20 years ago. So it means there is a problem somewhere, and I take this back to Dave Tickner's thinking about the implementation of the law that we have. So we are trying to instill some commitment and to create a voice at the local level, so that at least the governments now can try and work properly to achieve the tasks. But we are also trying to generate evidences across the resources. We try and track budget and resource for the water resources management sector to actually say that some of the tasks are not well performed because of the resources. Maybe there are limited resources. But then it makes me think of what we can be advocating post-2015, because we have been, we had indicators, performance indicators for water resources management sectors in terms of numbers. What number of institutions are there in place, what number of permit or licenses had been granted, what number of assessments had been conducted. But then I think we should put more focus on what on how these assessments are being applied, if decisions are made based on the previous water resources assessments that had been done, like the environmental flows assessments, and how really all the considerations of the happenings of climate change, drought, floods are being taken into account in the licensing of permits, for instance. So I think we really need to shift the focus and empower the communities to make the government accountable if we want to have some changes in the status of the health of the rivers. Yeah.
Thank you, Jane. Let me hand it over to you again. We can take one or two comments or questions. Yeah.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden, and it's a question really for Gary, to just come back to the previous questions concerning methods and metrics and the need for valuation of these impacts. PwC was instrumental in bringing environmental P&L into accounting using the Puma model. Why hasn't that been more broadly taken up by corporates, and why isn't it being an underpinning of the kind of valuation that these projects are all seriously needing?
I think there's kind of two bits to that. There's first scaling up environmental profit and loss accounting, and then the second part that I think is even maybe a stronger question for water issues, particularly when we look at the health, the equity implications of those, is the social valuation, SP&L. And I think part of the reason that there hasn't been a really rapid scale up in those is that it is complex. To perform environmental and social valuations, we're hiring environmental economists as quick as we can, as quick as they're graduating. So I think that there's also no. We talked in the last session on standards. Standards are emerging, but not yet in this area. So there are moves afoot to develop a natural capital protocol that I think would help move in this direction. There's some meetings, particularly around water, that WWF is convening end of this month with WVCSD and others to try and scale up from the WVCSD's water valuation work and move on to another sort of more standardized approach there. OECD and others are also moving in that direction. So I think it's to come, but just not there yet.
Thank you, Gary. Tony.
Sorry to continue on the same theme, but it's a great privilege to have you here, Gary, in that you're from PwC. Now, the accounting organizations are divided into two. There's the people that do the accounts and audit, and then there are people that do the consulting. Whenever I meet people from PwC or Deloitte or the others, I always meet people from the consulting side and not from the accounting side. And I noticed you said environmental economists rather than environmental accountants. Is there a problem? Because my point earlier, I've made elsewhere, is that we need to get the accountants on board. The the economists, as I said, know what should be done. The accountants don't know what can be done because they're operating a system which they're policing as well as evolving. I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that. And second small question, in that I asked a question earlier, who got there first, or who's leading the way, the investor or the corporates? And Olam, I think, made a very good point that, and I think from their experience, they are leading in a very particularly interesting way. But could you comment on that? Are the investors taking account of what you're trying to do? Because ultimately, as the consumers and the investors are the people that get things changed.
I'll go really quickly and do them in reverse order. Firstly, I think I would, at a broad level, agree with Kate and with the previous panel that it's maybe investors that I see that are driving the action there. We've had quite a lot of work all around the world, particularly in the last year with private equity, trying to look both at the acquisition stage and then also, you know, in their portfolio businesses, how do they get the most out of being sustainable companies? Not to say progressive businesses aren't doing a lot. I think that they are, but I think that in terms of the drivers for their activity, probably investor pressures more than regulatory pressures or consumer-based pressures seem to be, at least from my view, some of the stronger animating factors. And then accountants or economists, yeah. So I sit in neither of those, or both. But I think that you know, we're seeing quite a increase in interest from our global assurance business right now. So we've talked about some of the standards that are emerging, but we didn't talk too much about sustainability reporting. The Global Reporting Initiative, SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, the sustainability standards that are coming out on the International Integrated Reporting Council, even the kind of traditional IFAC and traditional accounting standards setting bodies are now taking this on. And so I can only see it as a parallel of the market, that now in PwC, it's really our accountants, our chief accountants, that are now taking over this kind of issue to be a sign that, you know, it's the market's moving in the right way. Yeah.
Markets are very dangerous.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dave, I'm keen that our discussants do get to say their piece. So if we could take the third discussant and then your question, Dave, and others. So Beatrice, would you like to comment or question?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers for the very inspiring presentations. It was great to hear about your amazing projects. I will keep it short for matters of time, although I have, of course, a lot of thoughts from all the discussion today. And I would like to go back to the very title of this session, about managing water for equitable and sustainable growth, and particularly focusing on the equitable bit. So we've talked about a lot today about who we need to involve to deliverable equitable water resource to deliver water resources in an equitable way to the different groups of the population, and in particular the most marginalized and vulnerable people. We've talked about, Katie mentioned, power inequalities between communities and corporations. We've talked about the role of the local state, the local government, the national government. What I haven't heard that much, and I would like to hear the thoughts of the speakers on that because of their work at the community level, is power inequalities within communities. So oftentimes, most of the times actually, communities are not homogeneous entities. They're very differentiated. You have really strong power dynamics within the communities, between groups, between individuals even. You have conflicts arising within communities. So I wonder how you take into account this differentiation within what we've talked about as a unit today. Yes, what are the consequences of these differences within communities in terms of delivering water resources and water services in an equitable way to the different components of the communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. I think we'll see if there's any member of the presenters who would like to respond to that straight away, or anybody from the audience. Yeah. Kat, yeah?
Yeah.
And then Vinny?
Thank you, Beatrice. Yeah, it's difficult. You're right. A community isn't just a nice village somewhere in a rural area that just acts as one whole, as we often talk about it. There are obviously power dynamics and things, as you alluded to. And I guess we've recognized this, and that's why I was speaking about complexity and complex situations where you have different actors with different powers who have different views on what should be done about the river, often working in isolation. So I suppose the social learning process that we're trying to do in Rawaha is trying to address those differentiations between power and needs. But as I said, it's a pilot, so it's yet to be seen whether it will work.
Hi, Beatrice, thanks. That was a
good question. Yeah, I mean, if I could just relate it to the Burkina Faso case study, it's a very important issue, definitely equity within the community. And the approach described attempts to get to the bottom of some of these disputes or conflicts that happen in the background, that if you're just in a plenary discussion with the community, then they won't come out because people will be afraid to raise the issues. It attempts to deal with that by splitting off different groups, talking to individuals, having quite an in-depth appraisal of what the risks are, what the challenges people face are. And in these communities with the dependence on livestock, in times of when the surface sources are dried up, you do see situations where women are marginalized, pushed aside, and the cattle watering takes priority, brings conflicts. You have other people coming from other villages, other areas, just pushing people out of the way, basically. So the operating principles attempt to address those inequalities, but first of all, they have to be raised and brought up, and that's quite a complex process. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, just to mention, but I would echo everything that Vinny and Kat said, and it is something that, like I said, but CAFOD's a generalist organisation, and quite often we come at our projects through a different thematic, and quite often that looks at inequality in the community, and then might address water as a kind of a way of trying to look at those inequalities. So it can come from the opposite direction, but all of our projects go through a process of doing a vulnerability and inequality analysis throughout the project. So that's prior to working in the project and at different milestones throughout it as well. So it is something that we mainstream into our work, and I think it's just really important that you do that on a project by project basis and don't make any assumptions, because obviously there are different power dynamics of, I think Vinny mentioned gender, but age and caste, and it can be so complex and so dynamic that it really should be done at that kind of very low level.
Thank you. Let's take two more from the audience. Dave was waiting, and I think the gentleman at the back, and then Leslie.
Thanks. I wanted to ask a question that kind of connects the last two questions we have from the audience, which are about sort of the private sector and accounting, the points that Jane raised and the presentations that we heard. So we've talked a lot today about the private sector, mostly the international private sector, and how they can play a role in all of this. One of the things that struck me with Katie's, Kat's and Vinny's presentations was that none of you guys really dwelt that much on the role of the private sector. And I'm guessing, and I certainly know this is the case from Ruaha and some of the other places that Kat talked about, actually the international private sector may not have a big role to play there. They just simply don't have enough of a presence, enough of an interest, enough of a supply chain, enough of an investment in many parts of the world. Jane was talking about that challenge of implementing law. So I'm just wondering that if the international private sector and all the investors and all the consultants can't help with that implementation challenge in places like bits of Peru or Ruaha or wherever it may be, Burkina Faso, what are the other levers that we might be able to pull to try and help governments meet that implementation challenge?
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman at the back here.
Okay. We talked at different levels around sort of governance and institutional arrangements. A number of people mentioned water user associations, and we've talked about sort of basin level management arrangements. I just wonder whether anybody's sort of had an experience of using some of the ideas around common property management that came out of Eleanor Ostrom and people like that, where sort of rules were developed in terms of how you actually effectively manage institutional arrangements for things like water user association, fishers associations. I'd be interested to know if anybody's aware of any application of those sorts of ideas to the management of water resources. Thanks.
Who'd like to start on that? Vinny?
Could answer part of Dave's question there about other levers that need to be pulled to address the challenge of implementation. I mean, the critical challenge that we see is that whilst there's a reasonable amount of money, not enough money available for getting new services in to communities, it's certainly not enough, but there is some money there. There's a huge deficit of money available for keeping those services running, services obviously playing a critical role in people's water security. So somehow we have to move to a situation where that money is available for sustaining services. And it's difficult to get away from subsidy there, especially in remote rural areas where the local private sector is extremely weak. I mean, the local private sector is essentially the farmers who are using the water, but they don't really have much capital available to pay for services to be sustained. So we need to find service delivery models that bring with them the ability to keep services running at the district level for eternity. And it's been elusive so far, but basically those solutions need to be found. On the question about Eleanor Ostrom, someone who was instrumental in shaping this community-based water resource management approach, St John Day, as part of his PhD, he based some of the principles within the approach on Eleanor Ostrom's work, interestingly. So some of the principles of common property management are ingrained within it. Maybe Leslie could say a bit more about that, because the approach was actually done together with Oxfam, WaterAid and Oxfam in the early days, and St John was instrumental in bringing that together.
That could be a good lead-in to you, Leslie. Don't feel you necessarily have to address that, but do you have that or other comments or points?
Yeah, well, I was going to add a bit because, yeah, as Vincent mentioned, that Oxfam's working similarly in community-based water resource management, and we have quite a few years' experience in river basin programming. I was actually going to touch a bit on something I feel that wasn't that's maybe related to what we discussed at the beginning of the day, and that's asking the question, where do the benefits of improved community based measures of water resource management go? At Oxfam, we're seeing many examples of land and water grabs in Asia and Africa on a very large scale. This could be, so in many cases, these benefits are actually going to external investors. So agribusinesses or governments directly engaging in agricultural production for various reasons, largely driven by price speculation after the 2008 price spike. So I think, this really brings a question again. We talked about scales, but the need to address scales, and that's something that's really important to ensure that improved water security doesn't, for one group, doesn't come at a cost for another more marginalized group. Again, I also just want to mention we have quite a long experience of river basin programming, a bit similar to WWF on the Brahmaputra and Indus river basins. And actually, our work was driven a bit differently by community-based risk reduction, but we found that it was quite a failure if we just focused at the community level. So the need to address partnerships on a wide scale, for instance, the fact that river basin planning is so political, especially in South Asia, that after many years we found that we were just creating sort of islands of excellence, and actually that we couldn't find a way to bring into the geopolitical elements of India's power over Bangladesh, for instance. So I think it's been mentioned before, the need to look at different partnerships at different scales. And I'm sorry, that didn't address the Eleanor Ostrom question at all, but I think, we did, I wasn't there at the beginning when we did try to develop the approach, but I think there's some of the common pool resources, especially in the agro-pastoralist zones, that we try to adopt, and look at the issue of how, I think the issue of conflict and cooperation is really important, especially when working in those kind of zones. But yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't come to greater detail about that particular one.
Okay, thank you very much, Leslie. We've got about 5 minutes. Are there other Words of wisdom, burning comments? Oh yes, lots over there. Great. Roger, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, as soon as you mentioned the word wisdom, I put it back down again. But,
we expect it.
Yeah. I mean, just to chip in on the kind of common property regimes. I mean, we were doing some work on this about 15 years ago between ODI and BGS, and it's I think limited potential, and one of the reasons is because water is a fugitive resource. You don't know where the resource boundaries are. You can't put a fence around it, and you have a numbers problem. So one of my questions about this idea of community-based management of water resources is, despite its kind of warm persuasiveness and the kind of moral authority that anything to do with, you mentioned the word community. I mean, not just sort of intra-community relations and wealth disparities and so on and so forth, but the simple problem of scale. So communities are small, water resources are bigger. So even if several villages come together and manage resources in a certain way, the villages outside, say, that common property regime can simply free ride on the efforts of others and capture the resources. So I'd be very interested to know from the kind of WaterAid side, what's the difference in a project village where these kinds of activities have happened versus one where they haven't, and is there a difference? And the second question, am I allowed to, and the comment really for Jane, I'm very interested in this idea of holding power to account, which you spoke about. I just wonder what rights are being defended and what is the reaction?
Okay, thank you, Roger. Nick, and then over there.
I'm hoping Jane will answer Dave's question about where are the levers. And what we're trying to do with the Uhakika Wamaji project is to use people power as a lever. You're right that in many basins there aren't corporates, there aren't WWFs to make the system work. So what we're trying to do is to help people affected by water resource management understand what the law says and which institutions are responsible. And we think our theory of change is that's very powerful for people to be holding their governments and civil servants to account for better delivery. We don't know if it's going to work yet. I'll let Jane talk about what the response has been, but surely it's a promising area for us to attempt to, rather than trying to intervene and solve people's problems for them, to try and get governance to work.
Okay, thank you, Nick. And just one more over here.
Hi, so also a bit of a feedback to Dave, really. It's just a bit of an elaboration on something we do, again, with communities in the broadest sense and farming communities. So we don't just rely, businesses like ours don't just rely on farmers. We actively work with them, particularly where water and livelihoods are key concerns. So one way we do this is through something called the OLAM Livelihood Charter, which has 8 principles that we try and address. Environmental impacts, water being one of them, but other key levers that people should take account of are things like finance. So farmers typically don't have very good credit rating, or any credit rating, or any access to credit. So it needs people to microfinance, just provision of seeds, tools, to get farmers going at the start of a season. So as a agricultural supply chain company, we know that if farmers haven't planted by certain dates, then we won't get our crop to supply either our customers or our processing factories. So one of the things that we do for, I think it's almost 400,000 farmers now, is apply all of these 8 principles, including financing. So we know that financing is one of the key aspects that business needs to address. So more people out there who could look at the microfinancing of rural communities would be a fantastic way forward. And also in that is how can you set up microfinancing for water and sanitation is something that really needs to factor into that, because it fits the whole livelihood discussion, the whole livelihood debate.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to ask Jane to respond, and also Vinny, and Kat and Katie, if you wish to.
Thank you. And just to respond to the questions about rights, the rights of the communities around water. I can give you an example, maybe 2 or 3 if you allow me. We have a case in Tanzania, in Wamiruvu. There is pollution of the Ngerengere River. There are some industries upstream, textiles, tanneries, and the river is really polluted. And we know that it has elements like pathogens, nitrates, cambrium, and the communities who are using that water, about 4,000 or over 4,000 people depend on that water for domestic uses. They don't drink it when it's polluted, but at least we know that they use it for washing, taking a bath, and other agricultural activities. And unfortunately, that area, whole of the area, cannot opt groundwater because groundwater is saline. So we help them question the responsible institutions about what the quality of the water is and what actions the government can take, because we understand that the government can take measures to clear pollution in the river as per the legislations, the Environment and Water Management Acts and regulations. But then we are trying to track response from the government towards to the communities, and we are documenting that so that we can advocate for the government to take actions, because that is not something that really require some expertise from outside coming to tell us that you have this problem, you should be doing this. Another example is around we have a case in Kilombero Valley where the government has a big Result Now initiative, and it's the area where we have the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania, where the government wants to expand over 400,000 hectares for rice production, but there is no environmental flows assessment to support such kind of a project. And there are people downstream of that river valley doing fishing. So the fisher folks are actually going to be affected, and there are livestock keepers there who depend on water from that river. So we speak with those people, we let them know about the law, their rights and obligations, so that they can actually channel their voices through to the government so that they can do something. And another thing is about permits. Oh. Okay, I want to
you a little bit.
Okay, about licenses here, you call them abstraction licenses. Well, in the basins there in Tanzania, even in Ruaha, you find that there are abstractions. You can have more than 5,000 abstractions from the rivers, but the abstractions with permits could be only like 200, 300. So we want to activate the government to start giving permits to the local communities, because they are the ones, the local farmers and others are the ones who really lack the permits. And some of these, some of the communities in areas where we work have applied for permits for more than 7 years, and they have not been granted the permits, even if they're paying for water user fees. So that those are the kinds of rights that we're trying to defend, and we're trying to document the whole process so that we can create an advocacy package. Yeah.
Jane, thank you very much for that. 3 great examples. I'm going to give the last word to Vinny. Our time is up. Just half a minute.
Okay. Some very, very nice questions from Roger there. So yeah, just to respond. Firstly, this approach, although it's called community-based water resource management, that isn't really strictly a good description of what it is. It's about cementing relationships between people in rural areas with their local governments and having a chain of communication with the local governments and national governments for assistance to be provided should it be necessary in times of drought or other situations whereby you have water-related risks. So we should perhaps rename the approach, I think. It's not something that I would say is an answer. It's still being trialed. After 5 years, you know, you still can't tell if it's brought about major benefits. And I certainly wouldn't advocate use of the approach in a situation where you've got intensive abstraction for irrigation, because there are major questions over the ability of irrigators to self-regulate. So having that kind of self-regulation framework in this is community-run structure. It's been tried elsewhere, and there are limited success stories, although there may be some that I'm just not aware of. But what I would say is the point about not knowing where the boundaries are for water resources. This is why the approach was developed, because with IWRM, the basin is the boundary. If you ask me, what's the boundary of my catchment here, sitting here in this room, I wouldn't know whether it's in the Mendips or whatever. I don't know. And if you ask an African villager, where is the boundary of your catchment, how would they know either? I mean, we just don't know as people, as citizens, where our boundaries are. So what's a meaningful boundary? And I know Nick's done some good work on this, the Holons, smaller units of water management. This approach is based on an even smaller unit of water management, which if you look at it in IWRM sense, is not technically feasible to manage water within this small unit. But collectively, within these villages, what I would say, what's the difference between now and before? Well, there's a lot of talk about climate change, a lot of talk about climate variability. These are realities. Who's monitoring these? I mentioned the spatial differences in rainfall, spatial differences in groundwater availability. This approach is looking at whether there are any progressive long-term downward trends in water availability. It's monitoring that. Risk-based planning happens on the back of that. It's attempting to deal with the water management issues that communities are facing in the developed world. When you go to a lot of global water discussions, it is about big water. These are very, very important issues, but there are small water issues, and these are quite different issues that communities face. So in these communities, we're really talking about localized conflict around these water points. We're talking about people being pushed out of the way in arguments. So it's really about having operating principles that are transparent and some backup from local authorities for them to be enforced, so that that doesn't happen so much. So really that's what it's all about, but I certainly would not advocate applying this way of doing things to a big water situation. No way, yeah.
Thank you, Vinny. That was in danger of becoming a Welsh half-minute, but there we are. Thank you. No, that's helpful. I'm not going to try and sum up. That would be too difficult, I think. All I want to do is to thank our speakers and our discussants. I imagine I hand over at this point to Roger for some final remarks.